Now, over in China, Beijing authorities imposed more restrictions to stop the spread of a fresh COVID-19 outbreak to other provinces, including banning outbound travel of high-risk people and suspending other transportation services out of the city. It comes as officials reported 27 new cases in Beijing today.
The Straits Times China correspondent Elizabeth Law joins us from Beijing. Elizabeth, a two-part question to start. How big of a setback is this in Beijing's economic recovery, and do you think the city can avoid a full-scale lockdown?
Right. Hi, Yan. Hi, Ollie. So to take the question, this two-part question, but I'm going to answer it together in a sense. So I think I'll answer the second part first. Can the city avoid a full-scale lockdown? Well, the answer is that they are trying to, because this obviously is quite closely linked to the economic recovery. Because as we saw, nearly full lockdown, stoppage of production in earlier this year in January and most of February has already led to the sort of economic impact that we're seeing today. For the first time ever in China's history, we saw negative GDP growth in the first quarter. And when they released the annual work report, usually setting targets for GDP, there was no GDP target this year. So that already shows how much of an impact just 1 month of a lockdown has had on the economy. And furthermore, I think there is the political implications of it as well, because this is the capital city. This is the political and cultural and business, well, not exactly business heart is Shanghai, but this is pretty much the center of power for China. To have a lockdown in Beijing really would have a lot of implications, and clearly authorities are keen to avoid it. To go back to the first part of your question, I mean, whether or not this is possible to avoid. Clearly, they are doing everything that they can. There is very targeted testing in areas that are being affected by this, which means the markets, which means residential areas surrounding the markets, and even schools that are close to markets that cases have surfaced. So hopefully we can avoid going into a lockdown.
Right, so let's go to the man on the street, Liz. What has the general reaction to the government imposing restrictions again?
Right. So as someone described it to me yesterday, it's as though you have taken 3 steps forward and are now taking 2 steps back. It feels a bit disheartening. Some restaurant owners have told me that the moment new cases surface, and in the capital city as such, their businesses over the weekend were down 50%, which is quite a lot, because we're pretty much back to normal now. You're dining out in restaurants, you're visiting people at home, and now to go back to this sort of semi-lockdown mode where everyone is living in a bit of fear again has been very difficult. I think the equivalent of this in Singapore happening, how people are feeling, is as though this Saturday, right after phase 2 kicks in, the government suddenly says, okay guys, we're going back to circuit breaker mode.
Right. Liz, with Beijing's new infections being traced back to a wholesale food market, it brings up comparisons to Wuhan, where the virus spread from the Huanan Seafood Wholesale Center. I understand you've been to the market in Beijing. Was it surprising or not that another market will be the source of another outbreak?
No, so I have not been to the market in Beijing, because if I were, I would be under quarantine now. I have been to the market in Wuhan, certainly a few times, in fact. But why markets have been, I've spoken to a few epidemiologists and public health experts as well, and they say the reason why markets tend to be in a way a hotspot for such infections to spread is simply because it's hot, it's sweaty, people are in close contact. These are quite clustered together places. So generally, even if it were a flu or cold, it can spread quite easily in such markets. So what we're seeing on the screen are images from this morning, where I visited another wholesale market that is still running in Beijing. This is the Dayanglu wholesale market in southeast Beijing, whereas the market where the outbreak first surfaced is the Xinfadi, which is in southwest of Beijing. So now that large wholesale markets have closed down, they're moving to smaller places like Dayanglu, which are slightly smaller scale than Xinfadi, which is largest market in Beijing. But also authorities obviously are leaving nothing to chance. I was chased out of the market, not by security officials, but by storeholders who said that, look, we have to get out of here. You have to get out of here because health authorities are coming in at 3 o'clock in the afternoon to do a thorough disinfection of the place, and all of them have had swabs taken for nucleic acid tests to test for coronavirus.
Well, reports say that more than 200,000 people have visited the Sinfati market since May the 30th. Even with contact tracing and mass testing of those living in the market's vicinity, how high is the risk of the virus being transmitted out of the city?
Right. So to give you an idea of how big this market is, when they said that they were testing staff and and people who had been to the market, there was something like about 8,000 people as of yesterday, which is huge. This market is massive. There is no way you can get around the market without a car. I do not view it as an equivalent in Singapore. So the fact that it's also the biggest market in Beijing and in the surrounding region means that people do come here to purchase their goods, to procure things for restaurants, for supermarkets around the region, which includes Hebei and Tianjin. And so what we've seen over the last few days is that cases are showing up as far away as Liaoning province, which is about 700 kilometers away. So because one is because of what I said earlier, that people come here to procure goods. And the other reason also is that, like most of Beijing, the market is being staffed by migrants from the surrounding regions. And given that it was the weekend, some of them might have gone home to see their family, and therefore that is how the virus has spread.
Right. Well, that was our China correspondent, Elizabeth Law. Thanks so much for coming on the show once more, Liz.